silence around civil discourse and K through 12 education in U.S. schools. So before I start, did you know that currently 61% of Americans believe that it's both stressful and frustrating talking to the other side? Another 72% believe that we are more politically divided now than ever before. Finally, over 80% believe that political debate in the United States has become more and more contentious. It's obvious that we live in a very difficult time in our history, with gridlock and difficulty crossing lines. But the question becomes, how do we get out of it? And throughout this presentation, I hope to show you that teaching students civil discourse is the way to do that. But you would think that teaching students to interact isn't a very unpopular idea, yet it's still not the norm. So we have to ask ourselves, why? Well, in recent years, teachers have become increasingly worried about backlash from both administrative, parental, and governmental influences. And a lot of them don't feel comfortable enough bringing social topics to the classroom. So how do we avoid this problem and spread civil discourse around the United States? Well, I found that the main solution is removing teachers from the equation entirely and having students talk in small groups. Well, this has been done in the past, and from my research, I've gathered kind of 5 principles that we should include in these conversations. The first of which is beforehand research. Having students research a topic before going into conversation leads to more effective and productive conversations rather than just if they were going in with their opinions, they form from in-passing conversation. The second is having small group discussions, ensuring that every student's voice is heard, not the loudest, and allocating time accordingly so that each one is heard. Third is not avoiding controversial topics, which leads to the fear that a lot of teachers feel. However, we can't expect students to have civil debate over difficult topics in the future if we don't teach them how when they're younger. Fourth, we need to teach students that their argument can change. They can go into a topic believing something, but as I heard here multiple perspectives, they should be willing to change their opinion. And finally, moving the conversation away from someone winning a debate and someone losing a debate to everyone at this table is being heard. Find the most encompassing solution to some of our societal issues. So like I've said, seminars like this have been conducted in the past. So what did I do differently? Well, I wanted to find ways that we could measure progress, even within this short period of time that we conducted these seminars at my school at. So how did I do this? Well, I issued 2 different surveys. The first of which measured students' opinions towards policy topics, and the second regarded their comfortability speaking out in the classroom. But I'll touch more on how I calculated those results later, and we'll get into how debate and structures of these seminars worked. Firstly, to situate you, I did these debates in 2 classrooms, Mr. Klugman's classroom and Mr. Herman's classroom. Mr. Klugman teaches AP Government to 9th graders, and there's around 120 of them. Whereas Mr. Herman teaches AP US History to 11th graders, and there's around 30 to 40 of them, so much less and a little bit older. Now, how do we actually structure these seminars? Well, I split it up into 3 phases. First, research, second, discussion, and third, the solution. Starting with the research, let's just say this is our class, and each of them are represented by a dot. I split each student into groups of 4 to 6, where all of them represented a different stakeholder in their individual groups. For example, in the second seminar, we talked about the TikTok ban and whether it was productive or not. So let's just say the green student represented ByteDance, which owns TikTok, versus the purple student represented a content creator. And they came into discussion with doing research, which is on the table, the worksheet that I gave each student to fill out before they came into class. Then brings us to our second discussion process, where each student had a minute to share what they had learned from the research. From there, they came back in discussion together, and they had two separate phases. The first phase was to ask points of clarification, so no rebuttal yet, but just really trying to understand the point of view of each individual stakeholder's beliefs. The second was finally to rebut the points, but we did this in a very targeted way, where one, students had to address who they were talking to by their first name. They had to point out the specific topic that they were concerned about. And three, they either had to qualify that point, meaning agreeing but adding a condition to it, or two, disagreeing and really tying it back to their stakeholder. Again, that emphasis that they're the representative for a stakeholder and not necessarily their individual belief. Then from there, that brings us to our third step, which was a solution. And like I mentioned before, it wasn't one stakeholder won the topic or the solution or not. It was that every stakeholder's values were considered in the solution. And I passed out a few of those examples of how they really worked through the tension or the values at tension in their solution while doing so. And then lastly was their period of reflection. So again, we did this process 3 times: research, discussion, and solution in both classes. Again, we get back to that question is, how did I measure progress? So let's go back to those surveys. Again, there was 2 sections. One was the policy opinions, which would have students rank their agreement on a scale of 1 through 5. 1 being I strongly disagree, and 5 being I strongly agree, to various statements like the U.S. should provide free health care for all. Then there was the comfortability speaking out in class, which could be a statement like, I feel confident sharing my opinions even when my classmates disagree. Now, how did I actually calculate these results? Well, for the polarization side, I just went by modern conventions and said the left topics were on the left side and the right topics, and it gave a value to each of those statements. So that free healthcare for all might be awarded a -5. So if a student put a 4, they would get a score of -20 for that question. And I did that for all those questions, which I've also provided on the table if you want to look through them, and gave each student a combined score. Now, we did this in January, the beginning of March, and finally just a few weeks ago. So what were the results we observed? Let's start with the polarization side. This was the first survey that we conducted in Mr. Klugman's and Mr. Herman's classroom. But let's start with Mr. Klugman's. We can see that it's pretty normally distributed. There's a pretty even range spanning from -99 to +99, with a median about, an average about -4.3. So it was pretty normally distributed. But then we got to the second survey, and we saw a narrowing of opinion where the range now was at -59 to +42, with now an average of -1.4 for the second survey. And we can kind of see how these overlap each other in just that short period of time. But then there was the third survey. The third survey was very interesting to me because the range shot out vastly, even larger than it was before, and the average had gone more left as well. So I began to ask myself why this happened. And then I started to look at our survey style, and we had to move from a digital survey to a paper survey because the students, it took a while to get the digital version, and some of them were drawing patterns on this third survey. It looked like they weren't actually answering it. So whether it's true or not, whether that was an accurate depiction of what the students did or not, even in the first and second survey, that's not really the point. It doesn't really matter about how the graph was polarized. And that was a finding that I'll touch on in my takeaways from this project. Now let's look at Mr. Herman's. This was the first survey that I collected for Mr. Herman's, and we were at a range of about a -82 to +69, with an average at about a -9.2. Now in the second survey, we didn't see much change. The numbers shifted a little bit, but they stayed relatively similar. And this carried through to the third survey as well. And ultimately, we see a pretty similar graph in all of them, peaking around the same point as well. So what can we really take away from the results that I gathered? First of all, we are in a very politically changing time right now. Every day it seems like there's new news about our nation, and my seminars were only one piece of those conversations that we should be having every week, if not every day. So we need to understand that having different opinions isn't necessarily bad, but it's our ability to rather communicate them, which brings me to my second survey, which at our school was very positive. We saw that students, on average, felt that they could speak in their classroom in a comfortable way and express their opinions, showing that on both surveys throughout the course of this project, we never got a student in the negative values at our school environment. However, it's important to understand that BASIS is much different than every other school. But also, while data is great, sometimes personal testimony is better. And I left some pieces of reflection paper on each person's desk as well. But these were just two that I thought were nice. Some individuals said, this experience was fun. I thought it was nice that we could bridge together what we learned in AP Gov with real world politics. Another student said this activity was pretty cool. I learned a lot of new perspectives about presidential power, tariffs, etc. So what are some takeaways in general that I gathered from this process? One, starting earlier, these seminars is better. Like we saw, there wasn't much shift in Mr. Herman's classroom at all, and I noticed that as an observer. They stayed pretty, strict in their opinions, and some of them didn't even really take on the stakeholders' values. They rather kind of shifted to their own. But if we can start earlier in the classroom to teach young people that they can occupy a different perspective even for an hour, and they're allowed to do that, then we can have these conversations even like that in the future. The second takeaway, I found that polarization is not bad. It's a very negatively connotated word, but if we look at it, it really just means having different opinions. Having different opinions is not a bad thing, as long as we can use those opinions to better us rather than divide us. Third, it's necessary to understand the political climate of our times. These surveys I found are less to show whether the students become more polarized or less polarized, but rather to give teachers an understanding of where their students are at, so they understand their classroom better and the space that they occupy as individuals. One, in both the political setting, but two, in their students' comfortability within the classroom. And lastly, this is more than just politics. These conversations and values teach students and people how to interact in positive ways, which expand more than the TikTok ban, but into everyday conflicts we face. So, where do we really go from here? In my opinion, it's to spread this to as many schools as possible. And that brings me to the organization that I was working with for my senior project, which was Sphere Educational Initiatives. And their value is to deepen the understanding of the key ideas, debates, and foundational principles that allow for a healthy civic culture. Now, they've done this by issuing various projects around the United States, mine included. But the question becomes, how can we expand these projects more than the few that currently exist to all over the country? And I've done that by providing a resource of what I've done within my school and how teachers can now implement what I've done at theirs. So on your table, you'll see a pamphlet, one that goes over how I did this at my school and the process and results that I saw, and then two, how students and teachers can do it at their school, giving them the first step, which is to measure their climate, the survey that I issued to our students, a video of me explaining how they can analyze those results, and the spreadsheet they can input that data into. The second is to protect their classroom and protect themselves by issuing permission forms they can give to their students' guardians, ensuring that they cannot receive any backlash or that backlash is minimized. Third, preparing for the discussion, ways to pick a topic for debate, and the research paper that I gave to each individual student to walk them through doing the research for the conversation. Fourth, how to actually issue that discussion in the classroom, the presentation I used, the solution worksheet I issued, and then finally the reflection worksheet for each student. And then lastly, how to measure the results and whether seeing polarization is not a bad thing necessarily, and how they can really get to know their classroom better, so that we become a little bit more civil. Thank you all for listening.